I had an incredible conversation with the creator of the Ori franchise and also a game called No Rest for the Wicked. It looks incredible. His name is Thomas Mahler, and talking to Thomas was honestly a dream come true for me, and he did not disappoint. Here's the thing about Thomas. He once worked for Blizzard, and he's sort of completely 180'd, and he's now an indie legend. The best part is he's super honest, and in a way, he's radical in his approach to making games. So for example, here's some radical things he said in our conversation. He thinks that talent doesn't exist. He thinks bad code doesn't matter. He actually disagrees with me. He disagrees with me on the whole concept of, creating a hook for your indie game. We'll talk all about that. He's a massive proponent of early access for indies. And he also has some strong words for AAA. Surprise, surprise. And lastly, and I don't even know if I agree with him fully here, he believes anyone can make a rock solid indie game. It doesn't matter what your talent is. You can do it. There's a ton in this conversation. It's so good. I loved this conversation. So honest and real. But yeah, you're going to learn a ton. I think this one's going to help you level up. So stick around to the end. Let's jump in. But before we continue this interview, I do want to thank this episode's sponsor, Avani Sound. If you're looking to get some great quality music and sound effects for your current or future projects, I could definitely recommend Avani Sound. Their entire premium music and sound library is specifically designed for game development, and there's no AI used in their production. All of their packs are one-time payment with no subscription, and everything is completely royalty-free, including commercial use. That's important. Right now, they're doing this Spring into Development bundle. It's honestly a really good value for your money and a great addition to any developer's toolbox. It includes 6 music packs and 7 sound effect packs, all in different genres, which make it a great base for almost any project. On top of all of this, you're going to get their music plugin and frequency link plugin, which makes music and sound integration a lot easier. So if you're looking to add some high quality music, sound effects, and tools to your library at a very reasonable price, definitely check out their bundle before the offer ends by simply clicking the link in the description. Cool, dude. It's so good to have you on. Clearly,
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. You're a huge inspiration to me. We were talking before we started the podcast, and I was like, I'm pretty sure you're an inspiration to like most top tier game devs, like Team Cherry. Like when I see Hollow Knight, it's like it looks like it was inspired by Ori. I don't know if it was, but have you talked to that team at all?
No, but I would love to, because I can really sympathize with what position they're in, because making a Metroidvania is so unbelievably hard. It's so hard, and like the stuff I see about like Silksong, right? And people are like, oh, why is it still not out, and so on. Like I was always there on Wisps, right? And on Blind Forest. But it's just like, imagine, right? Like, I don't know if you ever tried to make a Metroidvania or anything, but like literally the entire game world is connected. And if you change something in this level over there, it could have some consequence in this level underneath here, right? Yeah. And it's the worst. It's so hard. Like you have to just keep everything. Like it's basically like, hey, you have a riddle in your head, a huge riddle for like 4 or 5 years or something, and it all has to work. And it's just the worst. So I'm really looking forward to what they're working on. I wasn't the hugest fan of Hollow Knight, but that's me. That's purely pacing and so on. But that's, like I made Ori, right? So it's kind of like out there what I enjoy. But I'm really looking forward to what they're going to do. Ultimately, what I always want to see developers doing is to push genres forward, right? And I think we did that with Ori, that Metroidvanias weren't really a thing for quite some time. And then in 2010, I think I approached Microsoft with like, why is that? Would you guys be interested in us making a Metroidvania, right? And we also we will make it very platforming focused and so on. And they were interested in that. Frankly, also like the Microsoft people we had on our site back then were just excellent. So they got that, and then I think we pushed the genre forward quite a bit with that, because now like there's a Metroidvania releasing every week or
I know.
so, which is
I know.
great. You know,
I kind of tell my audience, like, I don't tell them not to pursue their dream game. Like, if they want to make a Metroidvania, do it, you know. But it's not the best business decision.
it's really hard. Yeah, it's like making a fighting game or something at the start, right? Well, an MMORPG.
Hey, you know, that's my first one of my big questions I had for you was, we live in the TikTok era and the YouTube era. Like, what I mean is, like, everything is short and quick, and you give I've even fallen into this, and I'm doing it now with my current game, where I don't want the player to get lost. I don't want them to spend too much time getting lost, especially the first 5 minutes of the game. You want them to get instant gratification, or just they're hooked. Do you feel anything like there's something wrong with that? Because I look at old games, and even like Hollow Knight and maybe even Ori, where it's like you trust the player to be patient, and they play the game slowly at the beginning. Right now, I was talking to my publisher about this. The first like 2 minutes, you want to capture their attention. And I was curious, do you have a problem with that? Do you think we should trust players more, or should we give them what culture is asking for? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I can give you, like, I can tell you something that happened to me, and I still haven't figured it out. But let me tell you the story, because it's funny. So when we started on Ori, we initially pitched a whole different game to Microsoft. There's even like still a YouTube video out there that was called War Soup. Like, I came from working on StarCraft, and I wanted to kind of like mix Halo and StarCraft and do a first-person shooter in a way that I've never seen before. But that very quickly became too big for us, and we said, okay, let's pull it back. We'll make a 2D thing first, and so on. And that became Ori. And then during pre-production, Microsoft was always on my butt regarding, hey, what you guys are doing is pretty fun, but what's the hook? And I'm like, well, what do you mean? It's a Metroidvania, and it has platforming in it, and you know, we have these story moments, and that's what we're doing. And then they were like, yeah, that's all cool, but what's the hook? And I'm like, wait, what? I just told you what the hook is. Well, that's not the hook, so what's the hook? So I still, to this day, I don't understand, like, what is the hook of Ori?
Yeah, me, I don't know if there was a hook. You know, I was studying Ori today just to get a refresher, and I was like, there's no hook here. I will say, though, the hook is, correct me if I'm wrong here.
Well, I don't know if I could correct you, because I still, to this day, I don't know what the hook is.
I think you do have a hook. So, like, when I talk on during live streams, I'll sometimes review people's games, and I'm not perfect or anything, but I'll look at people's Steam pages, and I'll look for three things. I'll look for a visual hook, and you're smarter than me, so tell me if you think this is smart or not. I'll look for a visual hook, a mechanical hook, or a story hook. I'll look for one of the three. Now, if you can have all three, more power to you, you know. But with Ori, it's purely visual. Like, the visuals carry that game, and it carried the marketing of that game from its inception till now. Like, it's just gorgeous, right? So purely it's a visual hook, right? Now, also the mechanics are a little bit interesting because, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, floaty, fast-moving, sort of abstract platforming and not tile-based is very different than most Metroidvanias, correct? So it's almost a twist.
I'm looking at it always in a different way, and maybe that's just how my brain works, or how I, as a designer, look at things. So what was going on in my head when I was looking at Ori is I was just looking at games like Super Meat Boy, and I was a huge fan, obviously, of Super Metroid and Symphony of the Night and all the Igarashi Castlevanias and so on. And the thing that always bugged me about that is that, you know, as much as an amazing game, as much as Super Metroid is an amazing game, I never felt like, hey, the platforming is on a level that could be up there with Mario or something, right? And I was always wondering, like, why? Even if you play Symphony of the Night today, that's Castlevania for the younger audience. Even if you play that, the platform is very basic, right? And to me, it's like, well, if you look at that game, a huge part of it is jumping through that castle, right? And so my whole thinking was just, well, why isn't that more fun? Why isn't it, like why wouldn't that be as good as Mario if that's one of the core mechanics in that game, right? And so I approached it from that angle. I think it's interesting that you generally brought up the visuals, because to me, like, I came from Blizzard Cinematics. I was an artist for a long, long time. And to me, it was always kind of a given that we would make games that look good, right? Because we at Blizzard, like back then, the cinematics and so on, right? Like, and the stuff that we produced, like, it was just on a different level, right? And then, to me, like, it's, I came from art school and so on, so I never really doubted that we would make something that looks appealing to people, right? The much harder thing was making sure that the gameplay is tuned, right? That the gameplay is fun, because even if the visuals, like if you have that visual hook and the game is just not fun, and there's plenty of examples of games like that out there, right? It's not gonna do anything, right? So I think that to me was the hardest thing to tackle. Like, we spent a year and a half on Blind Forest back then. I remember that, just tuning the mechanics, right? Just making sure that if you play around in a blockout environment and you play this little forest spirit, and I don't even give you any graphics or anything, right? That already has to be so much fun that you just, can't stop playing, right? And I had this all the time, because we, like, on both Ori games, we crafted the entire world just with blockouts, like just with, black fills and like paint, like basically drew these fills and so on. And only at the very end of that, when we already agreed, like, hey, this level is really fun to play, now art can go in and like do some set dressing and so on, right? That was always the idea. And I think that's what made it work, because a lot of times in playtesting, I had to quickly look at a bug and fix something, right? And I'm playing and I'm like, shit, I just had to look at this bug, and I've been playing 20 minutes. I constantly at these moments, and that to me then shows you that you tackled it, right? That it's like, hey, that is really good. But the whole hook question, I still don't understand that. I don't, like, I'm not a very bottoms up kind of person, right? Like, I'm very, like, I came from art school. I studied traditional sculpture, and I was an artist for a long time. And to me, a lot of it just boils down to that feel, right? Like, and for what I appreciate, for example, in game designers, is when I can give you something like a character controller or something, right? And that you can just tweak the numbers and the values so that it feels exactly right? And there's a huge kind of like art there, right? With just making sure that every jump, every move, every ability feels exactly right, that the input is correct, right? That you get input back at the exact right frame and so on. And I do think people notice that, right? Like, there was always this whole thing of like Call of Duty versus Battlefield or something, right? And it's like, hey, Call of Duty was the only game that was 60 FPS back then, and it was just such a clear, that's a huge reason of why it's so much better than anything else.
Well, when I think about, Thomas, when I think about hooks, by the way, the first time this concept of hooks was presented to me was the creator of Earthworm Jim. I can't remember his name. What's that?
Dave Perry?
Yes, Dave Perry. He took me out to lunch. I flew out for some podcast for my first game, and then he took me out to lunch because he was I emailed him and said, hey, I'm in town. And so I was super young. I was like 26 or something. And he brought up the concept of hooks immediately, And I've been fascinated by the concept of hooks ever since. I see a hook as the doorway. I don't see it as the house. So like game feel and good mechanics and all that stuff, that's when you get in the door, right? That's why I say, for me, and I'm not arguing with you, I would never argue with you, it's your game, but the way I see your hook is I see the visuals are the doorway. They're the way you get in, right? And then once players are in, they're not relying on the hook anymore. They could give a shit about the hook. It's more like, is the game actually fun? And that's the house, right? So I think for me, so like for me, I think people listening right now, I think I would probably agree with Microsoft, which is like, if you're going to try and compete, and I would love your thoughts on this, if you're trying to compete with, let's say 10,000 games are released or 20,000 games are released on Steam this year, you better have something that catches people's attention from a marketing perspective. Something quick and fast and hooky. When I see Ori or when I see No Rest for the Wicked, I'm like immediately hooked. and it's because of the visuals. Would you agree with that? By the way, if you're like me and you always dreamt of making an indie game as a full-time job, I have a free webinar below that goes into exactly how to make six figures with just a demo. I was just like you for years. I thought I had to make a game in its entirety before getting a paycheck, but there's actually 3 ways to make six figures before even finishing your game. I've done this multiple times, so check it out below if you do want to go full-time indie. And thanks for watching.
Not really, because I'm again like my brain doesn't think that way, right? Like I think a lot broader. I'm just like, there's always been this discussion of oh, you need this one thing, right? Like the portal mechanic or something, right? From Portal, where it's like, oh, this is immediately interesting, right? And obviously, like if you have something like that, great, right? But I also grew up with, Miyamoto, right? And playing something like Super Mario Bros. 3, right? Where it's like, where the interesting thing was, well, every world had a different mechanic to it, right? Like, hey, here's the world that is this. Then there's the whole water areas, right? Then here's a level where the Mario is super tiny and everything else is huge and so on. And I always appreciated that feeling of, man, there's enough ideas in there. Other studios would make 6 games out of that, and that's kind of like what I've been following. And generally, to me, it's always about, is the game really good, right? Like, is the experience really good? It's similar to films, right? Like, it's very, like, every now and then a film comes out where you feel like, man, I wouldn't cut anything. Like, this is just fantastic. And it doesn't have any lengths. And this is just really good. Every scene is there for a reason, right?
Yeah.
And I think if you achieve that level of like, everything here is there for a reason, I think that's the thing that people want, right? It boils down to the quality of the thing, right? Is every single component at that level where it's just pure joy? And if you do that, I think your game will do well. It doesn't matter if there's 10,000 other games coming out, right? Because if there's if you manage to make this one thing, right, this game that is just so good, I think it'll do well.
Would if Mario 64, it was released right now, let's say some random kid made a game and it's called Mario 64, would it do well?
That's a really good question. It's something that I ask myself all the time, because one of my favorite games, if not my actual favorite game, is Zelda: Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo. That game did so much for me in terms of just even privately, right? That came out during a time where I was a kid and kind of like, I just played this all the time when my mom was at work and so on. And I asked myself that question quite often because, for example, I had people at Blizzard that were interested in making indie games, and we discussed that back then, exactly that question, right? Like, hey, if something like A Link to the Past would come out today, would that still work? And I do think it would. And we haven't really seen much of that, right? Like something that is at that level. Like back then, they worked like for 3 or 4 years on that game. And I think it would still take about that time to make that, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at, I'm always on the lookout for indie games that hit that level, right? That are like that, like something like A Link to the Past. And you barely ever see it. So I think the answer is yes, right? The same thing, by the way, is true with 3D platformers. There aren't that many 3D platformers out there.
Oh, I would
and
love
especially
that.
not that are on that level where the controls, like, I mean, Super Mario 64 is something where Miyamoto did the same thing, right? Where he spent a year and a half or even longer on just
The controller.
how should Mario control, right?
Yep.
That is so fun. You see that still today, that people are doing speed runs and just get a huge kick out of how tightly it's designed and how broken it is, right? But how you can use the momentum in different ways and so on. So I think yes, right? I think if you are an indie dev and you would make something that is on exactly that quality level, yes, I think you would have success with that.
My devil's advocate argument, and people who follow me, they know that this is a disagreement between you and me, because just by listening, they're like, yeah, Thomas disagrees. Because the reason why I tend to disagree is because 99.9% of indie developers, they can't make a game like Ori. They can't make a game like Super Mario 64 or Mario 64. They can't do it. Like, I can't do it because it's a highly talented skill to be able to make something that you've made. Most people don't have that taste, that level of taste. I think just realistically, like if you look at the probability curve, most people are in the middle here. And so my theory is at least have something that can market your game, that brings you some kind of revenue, right? It helps you get some kind of coverage, because I think most indies aren't going to be able to make any money. Now, I think a good chunk of indies, this is just my opinion, a good chunk of indies, they have a decent game. It's fine. It might even be good.
But fine is not enough. And good is not enough, right? Like we live in a hit-driven market, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that's just not enough. And I think in generally what you are talking about is almost like the discussion between talent and just perseverance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it needs both, right? Like, and I think talent is, it's highly overrated, right? Like obviously I'm an Austrian, so I read up quite a lot on Mozart, right? And Mozart kind of like fell into this whole, he was a genius kid who already composed stuff at 4 years old and so on, right? But if you really read up on it, well, he composed shit at 4 years old.
Right,
it was really bad stuff, right? And it's like he even said of himself, like, I mean, the reason why I'm good is because I work harder than anybody else I know. And I always took that to heart, right? Like it's not enough for you to, have some innate talent or something, right? It never is. I've never seen that. And here's the thing, like even at Blizzard, right? Like I worked with some of the most unbelievable talent there. And I remember we had like a day where we just showed each other our early works, right? Like, here's how I started with 3D graphics. And it was all garbage. it's just
I
the
love
worst
that.
stuff. Like we had Fausto De Martini, for example, an artist that I always looked up to, right? And he showed some of his stuff and it's just trash, right? Because he was like 16, 17 years old or something, right? So I think it just takes time to learn a craft and to become really good at it, right? Like it's not something that happens like fast, right? You need a good, probably like 3 or 4 shitty games before you make a good game. And that's why every now and then, actually, it's funny, but it's happened already like 3 or 4 times that somebody knocks on my office door. And it's some kid who, is like, hey, I want to learn how to make video games, right?
Yeah.
And I always tell them the same thing. That they need to do something simple first, right? Like fail really hard, really quickly.
Yes.
That you just make some, but you try to make something happen, right? Like here, I'll try to make a really simple platformer, right? So that you learn how much work is required, right? So that you actually can honestly tell yourself, do I have the perseverance to, and am I crazy enough to see this through, right? Because a lot of people, I think, don't have that, right? Like they don't want to work that hard, right? I do think that there's a lot of people out there that just like if you see how much work it is to create a video game, it's an immediate turn-off for a lot of people, right?
I know.
Because with games, it's just all these art forms coming together, right? Like it's not just it's a cumulative art form, right? Where it's like, hey, you have the mechanical part, mechanics, the design, and so on, but then you also have the art, right? So just the visual aspect of it is, like a painter just has to focus on that and give its painting some meaning, right? But we have to put all these various things together, right? All the art has to be there, the cinematography has to work, the music has to be there, the story has to be good, the design needs to be great, and so on. And that is really hard. It's really hard to craft a product with all of those things, right?
I know.
So I always see it just from the perspective of like, I think everybody can do it, but it depends on how much work are you willing to put in.
Yeah, I mean, what does that even mean? I actually wrote this question down in my notes, by the way. Like, can everybody do it? And what does that mean when you say everybody can do it? Does it mean that it's the tools are available to you, and with enough perseverance, you'll be able to do it?
Yes,
Yeah.
if you're willing to put in the work, I'm certain I could take some person from the street, right? And like if he really has the motivation, right? It needs that agency, that motivation. But you could teach that person to become really damn good. It just would take that amount of effort, right?
So no
but
talent.
I can tell you something. I don't really believe in innate talent. I think that's a bunch of bullshit, right? Like I was
Really?
always the kid in class. Yes, I was always the kid in class, and most artists will tell you that, right? I was always the kid in class who could just drew all the time, right? Like I didn't even care about what the teachers would say in front of me, right? Because I could read faster than they had to read these shitty books in class and so on. But I just drew a lot, right? And that's why I got good at it, right? And then that whole thing happens, right? Where it's like, oh, you're so good at this, it must be an innate talent, right? And it's like, no, it's not an innate. Like you just study it, right? And it's the same as anything that you study, you become good at it. And by the way, this whole thing about like art being an innate talent, right? That's actually a more modern thing, right? Like I just recently, a couple of years ago, I read a book about disegno, right? About that whole belief in during the Italian Renaissance and so on.
What did you say? What did you say? Disegno?
They called it disegno, right? Which is
How do you spell
like
that?
from design. It basically it comes from design, right? It's
Okay,
just
it's
this
like a
whole belief
Latin
of
word.
what-
Okay, yeah. I'm looking it up here.
I think it's Italian.
Italian. Oh,
but
okay.
The idea is that it wasn't like we didn't look at master artists back then and we're like, oh, that person had an innate talent, right? It was like, like it's making a great painting used to be the same as like making a great table or something, right? It's all crafts and you have to learn how to do it. And some people are better at it than others because they are willing to put more time in. I can tell you this. I've been doing Just Moon, right? We'll very soon have our 15th anniversary.
Wow.
I'm still working my ass off. Like it's never gotten easier. I still like right now we're close to doing our week inside. I think this podcast you said will only come out in April.
Yes.
But I am working a good 16, 17 hours a day right now. It's never getting easier, and you have to accept it. And we're always thinking, hey, with these tools that we have now, and with all of this stuff, and all the knowledge, and all the experience that we have now, and we made a game already, right? It's just as hard every fucking time, right? It's just always hard.
Well,
and you just have to either sign up for it or not.
When it comes to talent, okay, me and my wife were actually talking about this last night, how you are born with desire. Now,
yes.
maybe there. Okay, so like I have to create. If I don't make things, I'm miserable. I would rather work 24 hours a day until I die from like exhaustion than to not create. I've worked a desk job where I was a graphic designer, and I worked so hard to get out of that job to start my game studio. I had to do it. And I think that is probably the minority of people.
That is talent.
Right. I think we would probably agree there. Without that, you don't have talent, right? And I think the majority of people who want to make games, they probably don't have that level of obsession. Maybe I'm wrong. Like a 14-year-old kid or 15-year-old kid who's like, "Ooh, I want to make a Minecraft game." A
lot of times they see
you probably
as
don't
like,
have that obsession.
It's also something very different. Like playing a game is one thing. Making a game is a whole different thing, right? Like making games is very artistic and then also very technical, and so on, right? So those are two different things. Just because you like playing games doesn't mean you would actually enjoy making them, right? Same as just because you like eating something doesn't mean that you would actually enjoy being in the kitchen and cooking that food, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, it just takes a huge amount of work and so on. But if you do have that in you, right? That whole thing of like, I'm not gonna let anybody stop me, right? And I actually grew up with that in school, right? Like I didn't have the greatest grades in the stuff that I wasn't interested in. And I did have teachers that told me straight up, like, that I'll never become anything and all of that stuff, right? And like the most important thing is that you just never listen to that shit, right? That you just really listen to the people that manage to bring you forward in life, right?
Yeah.
That encourage you and so on, and you drown out the negativity. And by the way, I mean the Twitter thing that you just discussed before, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's so much negativity on there, and I don't understand. I wish we would get back to a time where it's just, hey, we actually push each other, right? And I love seeing that at Moon, by the way. Like, we have, for example, our team calls. We have every Tuesday at 4 p.m. we have a team call, and I love it because it's all just, hey, here's the art team showing all the amazing work they've done, right? And here's the design team. Here's all the work that we've done. And the idea is we inspire each other, right? And we push each other forward, and we want to compete with one another, right? Like, we want to make sure that, shit, my thing comes up. I hope my stuff is seen as good as, as what the other department just did.
Sure.
That's what I think is really important, that you always surround yourself with people that are positive and that, like, push you forward, that really know how to uplift you.
I have a question about that. So like last year, while I was in the middle, I was doing alpha testing for my game. And it seemed like everybody that was playing that game was negative. And I was just it felt just negative. It was like constant critique of everything. But looking back, I'm like, man, I'm really glad they were so negative, because now the demo we launched 2 weeks ago, and it's doing really well.
Way better, right? Yeah.
Way better. I think we're at very positive, and we have almost 1,000 reviews for the demo, which you can apparently.
I love to hear it.
Yeah, apparently you can get reviews for demos. I found this out after I launched the demo. Reviews started coming in. I was like, oh no! And the reviews were going down. It was like 83%, 82%. I was like, no. But it eventually went back up. And so all that said, because of negativity, it actually turned out that it was very helpful, and it helped the game. So I asked this to Ken Levine, and I want to ask you as well. How do you know how to parse who's saying what? Who do you listen to? Who do you listen to when it comes to your career, your dreams, but also, like, is your game any good? Is this worth pursuing?
I think it boils down to trust ultimately, right? Like, I have to have, like, or the people in my team, for example, have to trust me that I'm not a bozo, right? that I generally, like, even if they don't agree with something that I'm pushing for, right? That it might be a thing of like, oh, you don't get it yet, right? But you might get it once it's kind of put together and so on. Because we're trying to do new things and innovative things in a lot of ways, right? And a lot of times, like, I think we're all, as humans, we're kind of like lazy at heart, right? And so it's very easy to just say, to do the easy thing, right? And I think that's probably a survival mechanism of our brain or something, to do the whole, just let's do the easy thing, that the thing that already all these other people are doing, it works. Why don't we just do that, right? And the reason why you don't just do that is, well, you want to push things forward, right? You want to up the ante, right? And reach greater heights and push genres forward and so on. And I think that stuff is really, really important. Sorry, I forgot the original.
Well, I think the reason you said that is because sometimes you're going to feel like, or the team might not trust you, or they need to trust you because you're going to start basically spinning the chamber. I mean, an example of this is for No Rest for the Wicked. It's like on the Steam page at the very, what does it say? It says you're pushing. What's the last sentence of the Steam page? And then I know you wrote it intentionally. I can't remember what it was.
To reinvent the RPG genre, I think is what you mean, right?
Yes. Can you say that one more time so that people can hear it? I'm not sure if you.
Well, it's basically what we had in there was like something blah blah blah, and then set to reinvent the genre, right?
Yes.
And that is what we set out to do, because literally No Rest for the Wicked was started because I played Diablo 2 back then in the 2000s or something, right? And I loved it. I obviously also played Diablo 1, right? But then Diablo 2 came out, I played it with my friend, right? And I vividly remember how I was so excited about the future, right? Like I was just playing Diablo 2 with my friend till like 5 in the morning, right?
Yeah.
And like internet was still new and all of this stuff. And just, I was just, oh my God, like if we have these games today, imagine what we'll be playing 5 years from now.
Yeah.
And then nothing happened. that was it. Like World of Warcraft came out, but that created its own thing, right? But like in the ARPG front, you could very well make the argument that if you compare Diablo 3 to Diablo 2, that it was very much simplified mechanically and so on. And that was like such a, what the hell happened? You know, like that idea that I had in my head of like what a Diablo 3 could become and how you could push every single component forward, right? Wasn't really realized there. And again, like I don't want to step on people's toes. A lot of times I get a ton of shit for like saying something bad about some developer or something. But to me, it's just, we're all artists. We're all trying to push the art forward, right? And I look at something like that and I'm like, well, I would love to do my own thing, right? And take a pass at that, right? Similar to how, hey, if somebody plays some melody, right, and some other musician goes, well, wait, there's something there. What if you do this, right?
Yeah.
And then something forms, right? And that's the creative process. So ultimately, I had some frustration there with like how ARPGs evolved. And then it became very clear that I was like, okay, look, I did my thing with Metroidvanias. I would really like to take a stab at ARPGs because I do think there's so much potential there and it's not being handled right now. And then Diablo 4 came out and some other games came out and I was like, this is still not it. This is not where that next leap is. And I always look for these kind of things, right? Like if you compare Super Mario Bros. 1 to Super Mario Bros. 3, it's just such a very clear, that was obviously the right direction, right? That was so clearly just better in every way, right? And so I'm still looking for, and I hope I deliver that with No Rest for the Wicked, right? That you take something like Diablo 2, and then you ask the question, what is the next step, right? And in order to reach that next step, you need to look at every single component. Is the combat really what it should be, right? And what it can be? Because that's another thing with these ARPGs, right? Everybody just copied the Diablo formula, like to the T. And I just don't think that point-and-click combat is the best thing you could do. That's why we went for something completely different.
Basically, it's Dark Souls, right? I mean, it's Souls-like in its
certainly inspired. Yes, it's certainly inspired by things like Dark Souls and Monster Hunter and so on. But we have I thought it should all be based on animations, right? That it just needs to feel direct, right? Not like, hey, I click somewhere on the screen and then my character walks over and does a hit, right?
Yeah.
But no, give more control to the player and have him really be in complete control of the action. Very similar, by the way, to what I did with Ori, right?
Yeah.
Where
reactive.
Where I looked at Super Metroid and Symphony of the Night and thought, mechanically that could be better, right? And so same thing here, right? Where I look at that combat and went, it's good, it's not great. You know, so how can we make it great?
Is it stiff? What I mean is, did you feel like, for example, Castlevania Symphony of the Night? Did you feel like the platforming was stiff, and you wanted it more fluid and floaty?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I wanted it to feel more akin to Mario, right? Like that kind of thing. That it could be like that. It could stand on its own as a platformer, right? That kind of thing. And if you take something like Super Metroid or Symphony of the Night and you rip all the Metroidvania elements out, I don't think those games would be great by themselves as platformers, right?
Right.
Simply because it's not designed that way and the mechanics are not that. But Mario is. And so that's the thing, right? Like it's just making sure when you have a recipe that every single component is at the highest level possible.
Okay. Now, when it comes to Diablo versus No Rest for the Wicked, what do you feel Diablo specifically was lacking? I'm not trying to create a headline here, I promise. What do you feel? I'm genuinely curious because, like, when I play Dark Souls, and by the way, I don't like Dark Souls because my brain can't handle it, and I'm not patient enough, and I'm not good at memorizing things, patterns. I'm really bad with that stuff. When I play a Dark Souls game, it feels heavy and stiff. Which is by design, right?
Yes. Same as Monster Hunter.
Okay. Would you say that No Rest for the Wicked is intentionally stiff?
No.
And weighty. Okay. So
we do have weapons that make you feel that way, right? Like if I have a heavy greatsword and you swing that, you want to feel the weight, right? And that's just one thing. Like, so I look at it like similar to fighting games, right? Like, it's perfectly fine if you don't want to play Zangief, right? But a lot of people do, right? But there should be an option for you to play Ryo or Ken, right?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's what we have there as well. You asked the question regarding where I think Diablo went wrong. And I think it's just looking at the components specifically, right? Like, if I would have designed Diablo 3 back then, or even like Diablo 4, I would have really, like, you have to have the guts to rip it all up, right? And I do think that probably was happening back then with Josh Mosquera, right? The guy who was also handling the Diablo 3 expansion. From what I know, and this is just rumors and so on, right? But he was trying to do something that was very different than what Diablo 4 ultimately became, right? And I'm like, so from what I heard is that Blizzard kind of like, redid that project because, hey, it wasn't Diablo enough, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge problem, right? Like, you have to, every now and then you have to have your Super Mario 64 moment. You have to have the guts to say, look, that old formula was really good and we could keep making something like that in the future. But isn't there something greater there, right? Like that thing that Miyamoto did, from going from like stuff like Super Mario World and Yoshi's Island and so on to Mario 64, where it's just, you can take nothing with you, right? Like, you basically have to start completely from scratch, because making a 3D platformer, especially when there were no 3D platformers,
right?
I can't even fucking fathom how difficult it must have been to think of the concept of a camera, right? A camera, and how should that even work, right?
It's wild.
Yeah, it's crazy. But that's what I think should have happened there, right? That you really looked at, okay, let's take combat. What could we change about the combat? Can we really tear it up, right? Or are we just shipping yet another warmed up version of what we already had with some bells and whistles and some mechanics slightly changed and so on, right? And I think that's what it needed. And I think that's the fear always is that, well, but fans might not want that, right? But fans will come with you if you just make a really good thing. You have to have that trust in yourself that because you're the person who does it, right? Like, you will move it into the right direction. Trust me, if I do it and I love it, right? I love the project that I'm making. I always have the belief of like, well, if I really love it, there must be thousands or hopefully hundreds of thousands or millions of people who feel like me, right?
Yes.
And so that's how I operate, right? And it doesn't matter if it's different or that kind of thing. I don't care. If it's good, it's good.
Okay. Let's talk about early access. And this is the segue here is No Rest for the Wicked. You did early access. I think you launched it, was it April 18th, 2024? For No Rest for the Wicked. This is your first game since, wrapping up. I think you're wrapped up the Ori franchise.
I can talk about that.
Okay, so you're taking a break. Let's just say that. Do you feel like this is we can cut this? I don't care. Do whatever you want. Do you feel like you know better than the audience? You know better than your players what this game is supposed to be?
Yes. Ultimately, yes. I basically, I think about it just in the sense of Ori was sort of my Mario, right? And I always wanted No Rest for the Wicked to become my Zelda. And that's very obvious if you look at it now, right?
Yeah.
It's just with Ori, it was kind of like I focus on the platforming and so on, and I like the analogy, right? Like Miyamoto was doing Ori, like Mario first, and then a year later or so he did Zelda. And I always liked that kind of idea of like, okay, now we do an adventure game that is not as focused on like platforming and those kind of things.
Yeah.
And that's how I approached it. And ultimately, I never really had a doubt of would people play that, right? Because I remember A Link to the Past did so well on the Super Nintendo, right? Like, it was always like in the top 10 or something of the sales charts, even like 4 years after the Super Nintendo launched, right? And even in prototyping, we have this thing at Moon where I usually do the prototypes while people are finishing up games and so on, right? And the same thing was true for Wicked. And I just saw so many things that, like, I just put this character controller together and was like coding it up, and and it was fun. It was just fun already, right? Yeah. And I was trying all these crazy things, like, oh my God, I could even like do a little tower defense thing with that character controller, and I could do this, and I could do that, and I could do farming like in Stardew Valley, and I could do, and it's just, holy shit, there's so much we can do with this, And so I never really had any doubt that, would people play that or how would they react, right? Because to me it was just, well, if I deliver my Zelda, there should be lots of people who love Zelda.
Was the audience reaction and player reaction to No Rest for the Wicked, was it a positive one for you when you did early access?
Yeah. So we released our first trailer on during the game trailers. Sorry, not game trailers. The Game Awards, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I still associate Jeff Keighley with game trailers for some reason. During the Game Awards, and like a lot of people said it was one of the most interesting, one of the most striking looking trailers shown there. And so that was good. That was nice to see. But then ultimately the game came out and so on. And the thing that we tried to do and hoped we would get, right, is that we would form a little community, that people would be really passionate about playing this and so on. And that ultimately did happen. So that's something I'm really proud of. And so generally we're doing really well with that. Early access was a total shot in the dark, by the way. Like, we had no clue. We've already been working for a couple of years, right?
Wow.
And then, we had no idea if it would sell or anything. There's every now and then, we have to make these decisions where we basically bet the entire company, right? Where it's like, well, if this is not going to work, I'm, let me try the unemployment line. But it's okay, like, it's just, I have this belief of like, I'm not stupid, right? I'm going to figure it out. But if it's right, it's right. If my heart tells me I am passionate about this, I want to do this, I want to move forward with this, then you have to have the guts to just say, fuck it, let's do it.
Right. Was the launch of a early access game, is it beneficial, like in the sense that you can read reviews and figure out where you failed and where it's working? Like,
I love early access, by the way. Like, it's the best. It's just giving people something. And like, so for example, right, like Microsoft always had this thing with creators, with designers and so on, where they always warned designers like, oh, for user research, right? Don't take it too hard on, and all of this stuff. And I'm just, oh my God, I love user research sessions, because it's just, hey, there's nothing better for a designer then hey, I created this thing, I give it to somebody, and I watch them play, and I watch their faces, and their hands while they're playing, and it's just, that's the highest high that you will ever get, right? When you see a moment works, and they are really enjoying themselves or not, right? Like, if not, then as you said, with criticism and negative feedback and so on, then you win either way, right? Because the negative thing, immediately a light should go off in your head. Oh, but I can fix that, right? I know how to do this better then, right? And then you just fix all those things. And if it's good, great, like, then you get like, you get to celebrate, right?
Yeah.
So I always love doing these tests and like just giving the game to people. And early access is exactly that. Early access is just, you give the game to a lot of people, and with No Rest for the Wicked, like, there is zero chance. I don't care how smart you are as a designer, right? There is zero chance that you could design an ARPG that is as complex, on that level of complexity, that you put out there and it's fully done and finished, right?
Right.
It's impossible. Just, it doesn't work. So then you release that into early access, and you get all the feedback, right? And you get all the data and so on, and you just look at that, right? And then you get to shape it again and so on. A lot of, like, I grew up being a sculptor, right? And a lot of it is just molding, right? And like, oh, and now I see the thing that you're seeing, right? And now I can make this better, and like, I can add a little bit more detail here, and I can do that, right? And that's what early access is like to me. And that's amazing. I love that, because when we did Ori, it was always a packaged product, right? Like it came out and hands off, you can never touch it anymore. But then you see all the videos of like reviews and so on, and you're like, God damn, we didn't fix this one thing. I opened a bug for that 6 months ago.
Yes. Well, this is why, Thomas, I don't know if I believe in the concept of feature creep anymore. And I want to get your opinion on this. I think I said this last week during a live stream. It just sort of, it occurred to me that the idea of feature creep assumes that you know what works for your game and what doesn't. Like, without feature creep, sometimes, okay, here's an example. We did alpha testing last year for our game Twisted Tower, and we found out that people loved popping balloons. You have a mallet, it's a first-person shooter, and you walk into this, it's like a theme park, but it's like horrifying. And you could pop balloons with this hammer. Now, 2021 version of Thomas would say, do not spend money or time creating variations of balloons to pop.
No, do exactly that.
And
Crash Bandicoot, crash the boxes.
But that's feature creep, right? And I'm sure, and it's no slight to my publisher, but I'm sure they would have said, Thomas, this should not be in your milestones. But now that we've released the demo, now that we've done testing, it's like, I think this game is about balloons. Like they love the balloons, but like But feature creep is necessary, in my opinion. It's not necessarily feature creep. It's just
I don't know
being
if
playful.
I would call it feature creep. It's like, to me, it's more like follow the fun, right?
Yes.
You do these tests and you just try to really shape it and try to see what is the thing that people really enjoy, right? Crash Bandicoot is a really good example, right? Where at first they didn't have these stupid boxes everywhere, right? But everybody loved jumping on these boxes and crashing through them, right? And so they added a shit ton of boxes to it, right? And it's just, that's good. Follow the fun, right?
Yes.
And do more of that. Like if people enjoy something, just do more of it and try to fit that right balance of like where it's not untasteful or something, right? Yeah. But if you already see something like that, if people really see, oh my God, shooting these fucking balloons is like super fun, then by all means, add a million more.
That's right. Well, that brings me to what I wanted to ask you about AAA. It sure seems like AAA is. You remember the Steve Jobs commercials or the Apple commercials where you had PC and Mac, and you had the
yes,
you had the PC guy who was like straight laced and he was always saying this is how you do things, and then you had the Mac guy who was like cool, and he was free and he was open, and he could do whatever he wanted. I'm thinking about AAA versus indie right now, and it sure seems like AAA they've locked themselves into this mindset of, number one, you have to spend a ton of money. Number two, you have to accomplish all these different cultural things in your game to make everybody happy. And then number three,
you have to have 50 producers.
That's right. And lock yourself into the GDD and whatever all the stuff is that we have to do for this kind of genre.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on AAA? Is AAA going to survive?
It's in real trouble right now. And I mean, basically what I'm seeing, and this is, I think, what everybody's seeing now, is that I think we've seen the fall of the original game developers, and their retirement and so on, right? Yeah. And I can very much tell you that that's been the case at Blizzard, right? All the original talent has left, right? There is no Mike Warham anymore. There is no Rob Pardo. Frank Pierce is gone. All these people are gone, right? Wow. Mm-hmm. And I think, video games are still very young, it's still a fairly young medium, right? Like you still have people like Miyamoto doing it right now, but like barely, right? Like they're all started to either retired already or already have retired. You look at BioWare, right? And once the doctors were not there anymore, boop, everything kind of like didn't work as well anymore, right? Yeah. And I think it's that. I think what you're really seeing is, okay, here's these companies that were initially created by just creatives, right? Back then, those AAA studios were what indie studios are now, right? They just made fun stuff with like a 10-person team, 15-person team. That used to be AAA, like in the 90s, early 2000s and so on. Yeah. And then that changed, right? And it became factory. And I think what you're seeing right now is, well, these people all left for business reasons, or hey, my shares got bought out and I'm not happy anymore. I don't want to be an employee. any of that kind of stuff, right? And then now what are you left with, right? You're left with like a name, right? Like,
Yep.
oh, I'm, like here's a name and some IPs. But if you don't have anybody who can actually do something with that,
Yeah.
Like it's just factory work, right? And I think that's what people are seeing now, that there's no love and passion there, right? Like I remember overhearing Nick Carpenter being frustrated at Blizzard because when I was there, we were already growing to 150 people in the cinematics team, right? And there's this rule of 100 or something, right? Where once you pass 100 people working on something, things go to shit. Because like with under 100, you can still departmentalize things, and then you still have departments that are like 4 to 5 people, and then here's 3 more that work on this, and then there's 10 people that work on this larger thing, right?
Yeah.
But once you reach that factory kind of level, even if you're one of the main people and one of the main creative heads or one of the main engineers or something, right? Like you don't really matter that much anymore. And I think that drains on you every day, right? That you're basically seeing, I am completely fucking replaceable.
Right.
It doesn't, if I would leave tomorrow, right? Like maybe the studio gets hit a little bit, but it doesn't really matter, right?
Yeah.
And so, but the output is that it's not a person's vision anymore, right? Like I wouldn't there's a good question for like why are books still, to this day being written by one person? Wouldn't we be way faster if we would have books being written by 10, 15 people, right? And of course we would, but the quality would be utter shit. Nobody would want to read that. Same thing with directors, right? Like why don't we have like 10 movie directors? Or
they do.
Why
though.
are movies not being
like, for example, the Hobbit series? That sure it's Peter Jackson. But they had all these other directors who were directing in different locations, and look what you got. You got this.
Exactly.
It was like a McDouble from McDonald's. That's what that movie was like. Whereas Lord of the Rings is like a really nice hamburger. I don't know, like from a custom chef. So it's happening, and I think it happens behind the scenes. I think a lot of writers will also. They'll have plenty of ghost writers and stuff, and it comes across as watered down, and it's subconsciously so. Like
you can feel it.
You can feel it, or you can smell it. It's like a scent.
As an artist, I think everybody has that. Like you just like try to write a poem or something, right? And every now and then you'll have that moment of inspiration where it's like, wow, that line is really good. What I wrote here is like that touches me on some level, right? And there's humanity in that, right? But if you remove that, if you just have 10 people produce that every day, right, and they don't have that moment of like, real humanity, right, then who gives a fuck? Right? Like
well,
I think that's, by the way, that's why people have this thing with AI right now, right?
Yes, I was about to bring it up.
That. It's just producing that, right? Where it's like it does very generic stuff. I recently tried to use AI for a quest in No Rest for the Wicked. It's the most generic fucking dialogue.
I know. It's good for code, and it's good for code. Like,
it's great for code.
I've been using it for code, and I've been told by some of my friends who are game devs that I need to not say that publicly, but I'm just like, look, Claude's here to stay. It's gonna be here to stay, and it's great. It's super helpful. Jonathan Blow, I'd love to talk to Jonathan Blow about this because he's definitely been saying lately that software is getting bloated, and I'm like, it's just gonna get exponentially worse with like Claude
100%,
and Grok.
yes.
Yeah, but it's here to stay, right? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think there's a way to avoid AI?
Of course it is. No, of course it is. Like, it's this whole thing of like, we used to have typists. Like, the US employed millions of typists in the 70s or something, right? Then a computer came along, and it was just, hey, wait, we don't have to write up these letters anymore on typewriters, right?
Yeah.
And you write it once on the computer, and then you can print it a million times if you'd like to, right? So typists went away, right? And the same thing, like if I have to write some code and I'm like, oh my God, I don't know all these API calls or some shit, what would I do? I would just look it up anyway, right? Like I would just use Google search and like, I don't know, how does this function work? What do I have to pass into it and so on, right? you're doing that already anyway, right? And
Yeah.
with AI, it's literally just spitting out the stuff that it was trained on.
Yeah.
And so if it's useful, right? But AI should be seen as just another tool in your toolbox,
Yeah.
right? Because that's what it is. I use it a lot actually just for brainstorming, right? Where I know, well, it's never going to give me a final design or anything, right? But just, hey, come up with 50 different ideas for spells, right?
Sure.
And like maybe there's 2, 3, 5 things in there that I could actually use, right?
Yeah.
But that's I think really useful, and for code it's really useful, but also just for code that it's actually been trained on. Because for example, our gameplay programmers hate it because it's just we have very specific code that has to be written for our quantum network layer and so on, and it's just dog shit because it doesn't understand that code, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, AI, I think it's the same as like I love what George Broussard recently on Twitter posted about AI, that it's just literally he saw the same thing when Photoshop came about, right? But it's like, oh my God, that's cheating, right?
Yeah,
It can
yeah.
literally flip the pixels for you, and it's like, yeah, that's shitty work. Who wants to do that?
Yeah. It makes me think, that AI, it will eventually find itself in a situation where it's primarily used as a tool and not like a paintbrush. Like a paintbrush is used to be inventive, and a screwdriver is used to be constructive. And maybe I'm just generalizing it, but I just don't see AI as being ultimately inventive, like inventing something, because like in its very nature, it's the opposite of inventive. Right?
It certainly can't do that yet. Like in its nature, it's also still quite stupid, right? Because it studied everything about Shakespeare. But if you even try to just like write me a page of here's some story outline, right? Write me one page that is similar to what Shakespeare would write.
Yeah.
It just feels so hard. It's just the worst fucking shit.
Well, I think the difference between, sorry to interrupt, but I think the difference between an LLM and a human is that human beings, we are kind of LLMs. Like we take inspiration and we distill it down, but we mix it with something that's inherently in us. Something, right? Whatever it is. I think it's the soul. I think it's a divine consciousness to some degree, something that's magical. There's something magical that when you combine that or multiply it against our inspiration from other, sources, like I could take inspiration from BioShock, for example, and I could mix that with Thomas Brush, and boom, something comes out. Whereas with Claude, it's like Claude is nothing. Claude does not exist. Do you know what I mean? So you can't mix Claude with something else. All you can do is mix something else. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I'm not sure if that's...
But I'm sure all of these discussions had been had before, like in the 80s when synthesizers came out. And it was this whole, oh my God, we don't have to use instruments anymore. And what happens to all these people that play instruments? And nothing happened, right? Like they're all still employed. They all have their jobs. It didn't matter, Yes, the synthesizers were used and are used and so on, right? And lots of people can now make music that can't play an instrument, and that's ultimately a good thing, right?
Yeah.
You had all these musicians that couldn't even read notes, right? And still we're making music, and that's great, because art should be it should be liberating, right? There's a reason why in Europe all the museums used to be free, right? You could just go to any museum and it used to be completely free, and people could just do that because that's what it should be. That's what art should be, right? It gives you that spark of life that nothing else can quite give you, right? Like if you love something so hard and so deep, like it's like you can love a person that way, or you can love, some art output, right? Some result from that.
Right.
But not much else, right? I don't necessarily fall in love with the food I eat. Maybe some people do, right? But with music, right? Like, so for example, I mean, nothing hits as hard as if some musician, right, writes a piece of music that can directly sap into your brain and directly address some things. And ultimately, so with AI and so on, right? Like we'll see. I see this I use it as a tool. I use it frequently, by the way. I know there's a lot of AI haters out there. I'm not. I wrote an item manager that I love for No Rest for the Wicked that was fully written just with AI and so on. And I do the thing that Andrei Karpathy does, right? Where it's just, I don't give a fuck about the code anymore. Even if it's like, I have one script that is like 6,000 lines of code. I don't give a fuck. It's just...
Oh, that's so relieving to hear. I'm the same way, man. I live stream all the time. And sometimes I'll have like, it's not a ton, but I'll have like 500 people watching. And they're like, Thomas, how can you do that code like that? What's wrong with you? And it's it's horrible code. And I'm like, welcome to 2025, baby. You can get away with crappy spaghetti code and no one knows.
It doesn't fucking matter. As long as it works, right? It doesn't matter. It also, ultimately, everything has to be optimized, right? But it doesn't matter. Like I can give you an analogy. Like, so when I started out with 3D graphics, right? And 3D modeling, there was this whole debate on like subdivision surfaces on everything should be modeled with quads, right? With like, you can't put a triangle in there and so on, right? And it's just, I saw so many people that were so concerned about the technical aspects, right? Of like, but I can't do this thing. I can't move this vertex here and turn it into a triangle because there's rules against it, right? And it's this whole, dude, fuck the rules. Like, just follow the shape, make sure it's great. You can clean it up after, it's fine, right? But as long as it works, it works. You have to get to the gestalt. You have to get to what the thing that you're crafting wants to be. Do the cleanup after. It's fine, right? But get the art out of it.
It reminds me of the way that America, the 13 colonies, the way we won the American Revolution was you had the British soldiers, they were straight-laced and they did everything the right way. They had their lines and they'd walk down and shoot in straight lines, right? In rows. And then the colonies were like, screw that. Let's go run around in the woods and wear camo or whatever, or wear brown shirts and green pants. It's guerrilla warfare, and the same is true with indies. I just feel like indies are running circles around AAA. The same is true with the press. It's like shows like this and YouTubers and TikTokers, they're running circles around the press, right? Yes. And it's this mindset of saying, why do I need to do this the way that everybody's telling me to do it? What's the point? For me, I've always looked at the end, the end of the equation.
By the way, this is always how things move forward, right?
Yes.
Like that's also what rock and roll used to be about, right? That it's just, why are we still playing this folk music or something? There's all this stuff that we could explore and like, and then there were all the detractors of like, this is Satan's work and all of that, right? And it's like, dude, we're just trying to have fun, making art, creating music and so on, right? And like, if you can push like up the ante, right? Like I think a lot of times, like I have kind of like the reputation now that I'm a little bit, that every now and then when I say things at Moon, right, that it's like, oh, Thomas writes this very much over the top, right? But it's like, no, you have to, like, you really have to try to push yourself and try to really up the ante. Because my thinking was always, doesn't fucking matter. You shoot for 150%, so it's okay if you miss, right? Because you still land at 100%. Yeah. But if you shoot for 90, you will land at 70, and 70 is not good enough, you know?
Yeah, that brings me to my last question for you, Thomas. How do you feel being you? You know, there's a lot of questions surrounding that, but the first one is, do you exhaust yourself? Because you're a very salty person. What I mean is, like, there's a lot of flavor in, like, most people don't have a ton of flavor. Like, I was reading your Twitter today, or your X profile. And it's like, you have so many amazing takes. You'll do big paragraphs, or like 10 or like three paragraphs about an idea or just a thought you had, and it's not even about game dev necessarily. And I'm just like, you're so full of inertia or potential energy. It's just like boiling up, and you're sitting here going, I want to be 150%, and No Rest for the Wicked. The last sentence is, precision action RPG set to reinvent the genre. And it's like, man, this guy's like going all out all the time. And you're a father, right? So
I have two kids, yeah.
You've got 2 kids. You're running a business. Are you exhausted? How do you feel?
I think the important thing in life is that you just do what you love, right? And then everything kind of comes easy. So I think that's really the trick, right? And that you have to teach people early on, right? Like that it doesn't matter how long it takes, right? But find out your true talent. Find out what you're passionate about, what gives you motivation. Find out what it is, like what task it is that you would do even if you wouldn't be paid for it. And then do that, right? Because then, like right now, I'm working 17, 18 hours a day because we have to get this huge update out that we're working on for No Rest for the Wicked.
Yeah.
And I love it, right? It's just, I can't, like, I literally wake up in the morning, right? And then I look at the watch and I'm like, oh, it's, I've been working till 5 a.m. yesterday, and then it's 11 a.m. 11 a.m. now, and
yeah.
I just want to get back to. But I set up this really cool special attack yesterday.
Yep.
I can't wait to set up the effects and so on, right? Because I still have that drive of like just being as excited as a kid of like, man, I can't wait to set up the special attack and then show it to everybody and like get the whole. Oh my God, this is so cool that we finally have this, right? And I'm trying to do that in other people as well, right? So when we have Patrick in our team, for example, right? He's a huge farming game fan. And we're getting into that very soon with the Sacrament update, right? And every now and then he does something and I'm just, whenever he creates a cool feature or something, I'm just, this is so fucking cool, right? This is so I think that's what's really important also in any studio, right? That you celebrate each other's successes, right? That it's like that it's just that people know, hey, they're being appreciated, right? And there's a weird dilemma there with this, right? Because I'm not the kind of person who constantly compliments people. I expect people to be great, otherwise they wouldn't be working at Moon.
I'm sure they love you.
Yeah, it's just I don't know why, right? But I'm not that kind of person. Like but I love when I see them just committing something, and then in the commit message I see, oh, I worked on this thing, and I'm like, fuck yeah, that's finally in, you know, like that's so exciting. And then updating the repository and then loading that in and like seeing that is just, I still get a huge kick out of it. So it's that. And then I did have, because you asked about kids and so on, right? So for some time in the industry, especially in the development community, I did feel that a lot of people were kind of negative against family and having kids and so on, right? Yes. Simply because it is energy. You know, like ultimately, it boils down to
a ton of energy.
A lot of energy. A ton of energy. It's insane, but it also gives back a lot, right? And it gives you inspiration, and it gives you because otherwise, if you don't have that, and you don't have the private life side figured out, right? Then I think you can very easily spiral out of control, right? And just have thoughts that are crazy and really mess things up, right? I think just as humans, I think we need a solid base, right? And if you have that, if you have a understanding wife that understands that you're crazy, and if you have, kids that love you and so on, right? I think that gives you that solid foundation and that feeling of like, I know what I'm working for, and I know that I have people that are behind me and so on, and I don't fear anything, right? And that I think is what makes it work, right? Like the whole loving the job and then just do the right thing, just do what feels right to you, right? And even if people tell you again and again, like, hey, it's not the right business decision or this or that, fuck that, right? Just follow your gut. Because I've learned, like, if I've learned anything in the last 15 years or so, it's just trust your intuition. Right? Like just trust your intuition, because a lot of times you will, look back and go, man, I should have done it in that way right away, right? Because, just follow your intuition. For some reason, there's this weird thing, and you said you're religious, right? I'm not.
Yeah.
But there is, I don't know why, right? But a lot of times in life, like your heart already knows where things should go. And you just have to have the guts to say, okay, like, it feels like I need to head into the direction, so I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, some strange intuition. It's like the more I've made games, the more of a theist I've become. Because it just feels like, this whole simulation theory, I'm like, this isn't really new. It's basically just theology. It's like some game dev up in the clouds, he's got this server that he's pumping energy into, and that we're in this little biome of this game. And so when I make games, I'm like, oh man, I'm playing God here. And if we can create simulations here, who's to say that we're not a created simulation?
Exactly.
And so there's something there to that. And this idea of intuition, it is strange. It is strange, like how, what's so hard is that some people, it seems like they don't have intuition, and it seems like everything they touch just falls apart. Have you ever wondered why you seem to have a really good gut instinct, but people in your family or your friends don't seem to have that? Where does that come from? Do you have a good gut instinct?
We're all just in the. I'd like to think so.
Where does that come from?
I think it just boils down to what is the work? What are you doing as an individual, right? And I believe in that whole thing of like everybody has their own talent, right? And everybody is an individual and everybody has their thing going on. And we're all different, right? But if we work together, we can achieve things that we couldn't do by ourselves, right? And there's magic in that. There's something like, I think that's how humanity survived, right? And like just did better, right? Because, hey, I know how to make a house. You know how to cook. The other person knows how to fight. Now we become a little town, and things grow and that kind of thing. And I see that at Moon as well, right? This whole thing of like, hey, together we're better than we would be alone. Yeah. And that's a huge reason why you would not work as a solo dev, right? But actually work with people, because there's magic that happens when two people come together or more people come together and they all have a common goal. And everybody can help with their individual talents, right? That's really great. I don't know why you think that some people don't have it. I think maybe some people still haven't found the thing that they're after. Yeah. Could be, right? But I do think everybody has the potential, to have that. You just, a lot of times, like some people, might not have found the thing yet that they would do even if they wouldn't get paid, right? Yeah. That they are really passionate about, or they didn't have the guts to follow that, right? Like there's lots of, I wanted to become an astrologist, but I had to go to med school and become a doctor instead, right? And it's like, that's the worst. That's like, don't waste your life, right?
I know. Well, it really does. I think it comes down to fear. You keep mentioning guts, and whenever you say it, I apologize if this is offensive, but it makes me think of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Whenever you say, you got to have the guts, it's like that Austrian intensity of like, that he made famous, which is have the guts. I think I tweeted this today. What did I tweet? I can't get on Twitter. It's okay, it works. Okay. So I tweeted today, I said, and it's highly relevant to what you're talking about. I said, look, fear is often shrouded in wisdom. You think you're being wise when in reality, you're probably just scared. Say yes, do crazy stuff, take the leap, go on an adventure. You're not going to be homeless. You're not going to die. You'll be all right. And you'll have a cool story to tell. I think ultimately people are just so, they just get so scared. What if this happens, or what if that happens? And it's like, and
by the way, the shit could happen all the time. You could get laid off immediately from whatever. It doesn't matter, right? Like life's scary, embrace it, right? There's this great Game of Thrones quote, right? Where Tyrion talks to Jon Snow and he's like, hey, don't be like, just wear these things like armor, right, on you, and like nobody can hurt you. And I recently tweeted something similar with just, I took the kind of like Nike thing of just do it, right?
Right.
And a lot of times at Moon, for example, somebody will have an idea. Sometimes it's me, sometimes it's somebody else in the studio, right? And at a AAA studio, or at most AAA studios that I know, like you couldn't then just go and do that, right? Like, because it's just, oh, but that hasn't been discussed with the producer, and we'd have to have a meeting with that, right? And the production manager would have to decide on that, and like, hey, then there's the creative director, you would have to pitch the idea to him and so on. And it's just fuck all of that, right? Like, if you feel in your heart that there's some great idea here, right, and it could work, then it's so much better to just fucking do it. Don't think about all the edge cases. Don't think about all the stuff that could fall apart. And then also that's where experience matters, right? Like that the biggest thing you get from experience is just that you know how to handle situations, right? When times get tough, that you know, well, wait a second, I've been here before, right? I know how to maneuver a situation like that, right? And that's why it's really important to, like, have people that have real experience in around you, right? Because they will be able to help you maneuver things. And that, like, we do that 100% intentionally, right? That we just say, we want that feature in. We haven't thought about all the edge cases. Yes, the whole building might collapse. We don't care. we don't care. You have to do it because it could be great, right? It could lead to something really great. It's the same as you and your balloons, right?
Yep.
If you put those balloons in and it's fucking fun, right? And now there's this whole, should we turn the whole game into a balloon popping game, right? If you know this is fun, right? And like, it's the right thing to just fucking do it, right? It doesn't matter if it changes dramatically all your plans and so on, right? Life is what happens while you're busy making other plans. It is what it is.
Oh, I love that. That's a great quote to end on, dude.
That's John Lennon, by the way.
I know you didn't make that up, but that's a good quote.
Yes.
I'm going to cut that out and say that you claimed you made that up. Get you in more trouble. Dude, this was so fun, Thomas. It's an honor to get to know you. I've always wanted to talk to you, so this has been really, really fun.
I always feel a bit comfortable with that kind of stuff, right? Because I used to be in the same boat, like when I got to Blizzard, for example, back then, and the first time I saw like Mike Warheim, right, or like Nick Carpenter and so on, I was like, oh, they made all the games that I loved, and I was like in reverence, right, and it's like almost holy, right? And
yes,
I never, like, there's always these things in life where you feel like, oh, once I achieve this, my whole life will change and things will feel different, right? And they never do. Every day just feels like, okay, well, that's just the next day, right?
Yes.
So
the plane never lands. That's what I always say. You're never fully arrived. You're never fully satisfied. But it's fun.
Exactly. You're always a student, right?
Yep.
And if somebody, like, I that's why I always get uncomfortable with it, right? Because in my head, I'm still the same as I was when I was 22, right? And it's just kind of strange when people are like, oh, you achieved this thing, right? And you made Ori and all of those things. And it's like, yes, I did. And so can you, right? Like, go out, do something great, and then we will all be swooning, right? Like, that's what I would love to see. Yeah. That people just, like, take that also as inspiration, right? Like, look at the people that you love, learn from them, study their stuff, go out, make something better.
That's good, man. That's really good. Well, appreciate your time. Link is in the description for No Rest for the Wicked. You want to do that in the description?
Sure. Yeah. No Rest for the Wicked is a huge thing. We have our Wicked Inside. Again, like this podcast comes out a lot later than we're recording it, right? Yeah. But we are working on a huge update called The Breach. And there's some huge announcements regarding Moon Studios and so on that we're making during the Wicked Inside that probably will have been
a month
ago or so.
Yeah.
But it's really exciting. Like, I'm really excited about all of that and like where things are heading, where we're going with No Rest for the Wicked for 2025. And ultimately, I hope that people see, like the same thing that I'm seeing, that Ori was our Mario, and like No Rest for the Wicked becomes a Zelda, and like I'd like No Rest for the Wicked. Like, I'm not gonna stop on it until we really reinvented the genre and did the thing that we said we would do.
Yeah, it's looking amazing, man. Super excited for you. So links in the description for that, and I think that's it, man. Really good conversation. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Thomas.
Don't forget to check out Ovani Sound and their Spring into Development bundle if you want to add some high-quality audio assets to your library, as well as plugins to optimize your sound integration and design workflow. You can check it out simply by clicking the link in the description. Cheers.